Hello. So last week we examined just the first part of the 1619 project, the first essay called The Idea of America by Nicole Hannah Jones. And this week we're going to examine a very brief essay that was written by Janine Interlandi. Here we're going to examine healthcare and the policies that began to dictate healthcare. So healthcare impacted our post-Civil War policies. Remember that the Civil War raged from 1861 until 1865. And once the South had conceded, there were many political matters that needed to be attended to. But there was also a period that brought about another problem. Freed slaves had no access to health care, to training. They had fought in the Civil War either for the South, possibly out of fear, or for the North, for their freedom. And now they were having trouble finding good jobs, but also in maintaining a good health. There was a time period when many blacks had become infected with smallpox. Our essay's author, Interlandi, explains that smallpox was a problem in encampments where blacks sought refuge following the Civil War, but it wasn't that much of a problem for white encampments. Physicians had dealt with smallpox before and knew that nourishment and medical treatment would only remedy the situation. But although the war had ended, the attitude toward these freed slaves did not change. The essay's author, states that the idea of the extinction of the black race was a new theory being considered in the medical field. Our author, Interlandi, quotes one congressional member who states, "No charitable black scheme can wash out the color of the Negro, change his inferior nature, or save him from his inevitable fate." However, there was assistance. It came in the way of hospitals being created, approximately 40. But unfortunately, many of those were prematurely shut down. Remember that during this time, care for individuals was free. But some legislatures argued that free assistance of any kind would breed dependence, and that when it came to black infirmity, hard labor was a better salve than white medicine. End quote. The Freedmen's Bureau was established. And it was established in 1865. Its primary task was to assist those individuals, those freed slaves, in transitioning from enslavement to freedom. So they worked with them in order to develop trade. The freedmen's primary success is often accounted towards education because they built over 1,000 schools, and much of their funding went to institutions to assist in training teachers, as well as helping individuals in other trades. They were primarily funding historically black institutions, such as Atlanta Clark University and Fisk University. But it also had a health division as well. We're finding that during the time after the Civil War, there were over 120 physicians that were sent to the South to address medical issues, such as the smallpox. However, when the physicians arrived at these areas, they asked for more equipment or they asked for more physicians. Nothing happened. None were given. No additional equipment or additional physicians. We'll find later that the National Medical Association, or the N.M.A, was established later in 1965, and it is an organization primarily representing black physicians and professionals. One of those physicians was Dr. Rebecca Crumpler. She was the first female physician, the first black female to earn an MD, actually, in the United States. She worked for the Freedmen's Bureau, treating patients in Virginia following the Civil War. And note what she points out, that they seem to forget there is a cause for every ailment, and that it may be in their power to remove it. The question is, would they? With the power and healthcare, as we look at those two entities, the slave states had began to gain lots of power, congressional power. There was a voting bloc comprised mainly of segregationalists, and that voting bloc controlled federal programs under state laws, and they added certain qualifications to federal laws. For example, farmers as well as domestic workers were excluded from Social Security. They were deemed the fact that they were ineligible. We also have the Warner Act of 1935-38. And the Warner Act was to establish the legal right for most workers to join labor unions, to bargain collectively with their employers. It prohibited employers from engaging in unfair labor practices, but it excluded agricultural workers, domestic service workers, and independent contractors. Who were those primarily? However, there were black initiatives that were happening as well. Black women began a national community health movement. So they began fundraising and actually staffing some of the hospitals, such as Providence Hospital, as well as the Nurses Training School in Chicago. Black women raised funds to educate minority communities about their health. They talked about good nutrition. They talked about ways to prevent certain diseases. There was also national attention to health disparities in the minorities community, and it was highlighted through programs such as the Negro Health Week. Consider that for many of us today, employers give us company health insurance through agencies such as Blue Cross, Blue Shield, or United Health, right? They allow us to go to any hospital that we wish, but that wasn't always the case. Often the access to health care was unavailable through one's employer. Those employers that did offer health care, many blacks were unable to even acquire those jobs. While some were able to get health care through their employers, such as the Pullman porters, they were unable to access the services due to a clause that said they had to go to white area hospitals. President Truman called for the expansion of hospitals during his tenure as part of his initiative for a major health care plan. It was a failed initiative, but still he pushed for a major health care plan. Southern legislators obtained concessions in one particular act, the Hill-Burton Act. Within that, federal funds were used to construct hospitals in rural communities, particularly the South. But remember of that powerful voting bloc, states controlled fund distribution and had the ability to create separate facilities. Blacks were often barred from being admitted to white hospitals. Black doctors couldn't practice in these hospitals either. But both the white and the black hospitals were being funded through this Hill-Burton Act. The push for the healthcare system for all began a conflict between two medical associations. Remember earlier we mentioned the National Medical Association, which was there for primarily black physicians and professionals. There was a conflict between that association and the American Medical Association. The N.M.A. was part of a coalition to defeat this nationalized health plan. They called the program socialist, that it was un-American. The groups warned that such a program would result in, quote, government intervention in the doctor-patient relationship. Stop for a minute. What sounds familiar? Such calls were also connected to the introduction of Medicare. However, the National Medical Association introduced a counter message that health care was a basic human right. And while the 1964 Civil Rights Act, quote, outlawed segregation for any entity receiving federal funds, remember, which included hospitals, millions of people were still excluded because of age, employment, or income. So policies dictated who was able to receive assistance. Finally, in 2010, we had the Affordable Health Care Act. And our author of this particular article points out that the largest benefactors of the Affordable Care Act, or ACA, were 20 million adults, quote, saying that the biggest were people of color, many of whom obtained coverage through the laws of Medicaid expansion. So, very brief review of a second essay found in the 1619 project. I hope that you'll take a look at the project in its entirety. Again, it is a collection of essays as well as poetry initiated by New York Times writer Nicole Hannah Jones. Thank you.